Alaric Dorne and Serenya Dorne appeared to the world as the perfect couple, but beneath their quiet home's walls lurked jealousy, obsession, and a darkness so deep that it would end in a crime so shocking the entire town would never recover. Alaric Dorne and Serenya Dorne were the kind of couple people pointed to as an example of stability and harmony. They lived in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by neat gardens and families who had known each other for years. To an outsider, the Dornes seemed untouchable, a pair perfectly matched in appearance and lifestyle. Serenya radiated kindness, always greeting neighbors with a smile, often helping elderly residents with groceries or baking treats for community gatherings. Her charm was effortless, the sort that made people feel comfortable in her presence. Alaric, in contrast, was quiet, distant, and rarely attended the same social events as his wife. Where Serenya's life was visible and warm, Alaric's was contained and shadowed. The town often admired how Serenya managed to bring light to a home where Alaric seemed to retreat into silence. Neighbors whispered that perhaps he was simply shy or an introvert who preferred the comfort of his own thoughts. But behind closed doors, the reality of their marriage was far more unsettling. Alaric's silence was not shyness, but a simmering storm. Over time, he had grown convinced that Serenya's kindness to others was not innocent, but a betrayal. Every compliment she received, every friendly conversation she had with another man, became a spark that fueled his obsessive jealousy. He began to monitor her every move, interpreting ordinary actions as evidence of disloyalty. Serenya, though aware that her husband struggled with mood swings, never suspected the depth of his resentment. She continued to live her life as she always had, pouring herself into community work and finding joy in small acts of giving. To her, this was simply who she was, a woman who thrived in helping others. To Alaric, however, each act of generosity was proof that she was slipping further from him. He convinced himself that the admiration others felt for her was a threat to his control. What outsiders called charm, he saw as temptation. What they called compassion, he saw as betrayal. The more Serenya shined in the eyes of others, the darker Alaric became in the privacy of his mind. He started to withdraw even further, spending long hours alone, brooding in silence, staring at nothing as his thoughts turned sharper, more dangerous. When Serenya returned home from her community events, Alaric often greeted her with coldness, offering no words, only a heavy atmosphere that filled every room. The house that had once been filled with her warmth now carried an unspoken tension, like a rope pulled tight and waiting to snap. Neighbors like Julen Marris often noticed the imbalance. He saw Serenya watering her flowers with her usual smile, while Alaric stood at a distance, expression unreadable, almost as if he was watching her through a lens no one else could see. To Julen it was puzzling, but not alarming. He assumed Alaric was merely a quiet man who preferred solitude. No one imagined that beneath that stillness was a growing rage that would one day erupt in a way no one could comprehend. The Dornes' home became a stage where two realities played out. In public, Serenya was the beloved wife who represented grace and kindness, and Alaric was the quiet husband who kept to himself. In private, however, Serenya's light clashed with Alaric's darkness, each day pulling him deeper into an abyss of obsession. He began to view her not as his partner, but as a possession slipping from his grasp, and that thought was intolerable to him. What made the situation even more tragic was Serenya's unawareness of how much danger she was in. She believed patience and love could heal her husband's mood. She had no idea that his silence was no longer harmless, but poisonous, twisting into violent fantasies. Friends who spoke to Serenya often noticed her brushing off her husband's behavior with gentle excuses, never once admitting that she felt unsafe. Behind the neat white fences of their suburban street, behind the closed doors of a home that looked ordinary to anyone passing by, a sinister transformation was taking place. Alaric's love was no longer love at all. It had turned into obsession, into something darker, something that sought to control and destroy rather than protect. The mask of a perfect marriage held firm in the eyes of neighbors and friends, but it was only a matter of time before that mask cracked, revealing the monstrous truth that had been growing silently in the shadows of their home. The storm that rolled over the town that night seemed to mirror the atmosphere inside the Dorne household. Rain lashed against the windows, and the sound of thunder echoed across the empty street. For most people in the neighborhood, it was simply another unsettling evening, the kind where one might curl up with a book or go to bed early. But inside Alaric and Serenya's home, something far darker was unraveling. Hours of silent tension had built to a breaking point, the kind that could no longer be contained. Alaric had been pacing for much of the evening, his thoughts tangled and relentless. Every time Serenya moved through the house, he watched her with a gaze that no longer carried affection, only suspicion and rage. He told himself that she had betrayed him in ways he could never prove, but always imagine. Each step she took, each glance at her phone, each sigh felt to him like evidence of a secret life beyond their marriage. His breathing grew heavier, and his fists clenched as he sank deeper into a storm of his own creation. Serenya, unaware of the full depth of his turmoil, carried on with her usual calmness. She cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, and prepared herself for another day of community work. To her, it was just another stormy night, nothing more. But to Alaric, it was the night when the pressure inside him would finally find release. His jealousy and paranoia, long simmering under the surface, had reached a fever pitch. He was no longer simply suspicious, he was Neighbors like Julen Marris, whose windows faced the Dorne residence, later remembered hearing strange noises around midnight. It began with a loud thud, something heavy striking the floor, followed by a dragging sound, and then silence. At first, Julen brushed it off as furniture tipping over, or the storm rattling something loose. But in reality, the noise marked the moment when Alaric lost control entirely. The storm outside provided a cruel backdrop to the storm that had erupted inside their home. What followed was a frenzy of violence, raw and unrelenting. Years of jealousy and bitterness exploded in one horrifying act. Alaric's rage, which had been bottled for so long, finally broke its chains, and once it was unleashed, there was no restraint left in him. The walls of the house bore witness to the chaos. Objects overturned, marks of struggle across the furniture, the kind of disorder that spoke of desperation and terror. Serenya's life, once so full of light and kindness, ended in that eruption of brutality. Alaric stood over what he had done, his breathing ragged, his body trembling not from guilt, but from the weight of what he believed was inevitable. His obsession had convinced him that this act was a twisted form of justice, a way to claim back the control he felt slipping away. To him, it was not just murder, it was the conclusion of a narrative he had been writing in his mind for years. In his delusion, it was as though everything had led to this moment. When the house fell quiet again, the storm outside raged on, covering the sounds that had filled those walls only moments before. Alaric did not rush. Instead, he moved with a calm that was unnerving. His actions deliberate, as though he had prepared for this without even realizing. His clothes were wet and stained, his expression blank as he stepped out into the rain. He walked down the street with the same composure neighbors had seen 1,000 times before, giving no outward sign of the horror that now lay inside his home. The night swallowed him as he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a crime so grotesque it would haunt the community forever. In the hours that followed, Serenya's absence would begin to raise questions, but for now, the storm kept everything hidden. No one yet knew the extent of the violence that had unfolded in the house, that once seemed like a model of peace. No one yet realized that Alaric Dorne had crossed a line from which there was no return, transforming from the quiet husband everyone thought they knew into something monstrous. Morning came slowly, the heavy clouds still lingering after the night's storm. The town woke to the usual rhythm of life, but in the Dorne household, silence pressed against the walls like a heavy weight. Serenya, who was known for her punctuality and reliability, failed to appear at the community meeting she had organized. For many, this was immediately unusual. She was not someone who canceled plans without notice, nor did she ever simply vanish without explanation. Concern grew quickly, and whispers started spreading among neighbors who knew her habits well. Julen Marris, the neighbor who had heard strange sounds during the storm, felt an unease he could not shake. He recalled the heavy thud and the strange dragging noise from the previous night, sounds that seemed out of place. At first, he had told himself it was only the storm, but with Serenya missing the next morning, those noises suddenly took on a new and sinister meaning. Julen contacted the authorities, explaining what he had heard and how strange Alaric had seemed when he stepped outside during the rain, his clothes wet and stained in ways that didn't look accidental. Detective Maevis Karr was assigned to the case. She was experienced, known for her sharp instincts, and immediately sensed that this disappearance was not a simple matter. When she arrived at the Dorne residence, the house stood unnervingly quiet. From the outside it appeared normal, as though nothing had changed. But the moment officers stepped inside, the illusion dissolved. The first thing they noticed was the disarray. Chairs were toppled over, a lamp broken, and streaks on the floor hinted at a violent struggle. The air itself felt heavy, thick with a silence that seemed unnatural. As investigators moved deeper into the house, the signs of violence became clearer. Blood stains, partially cleaned but still visible, marked the path of what had taken place. Each room seemed to carry the echo of a fight that had spiraled beyond control. The discovery in the basement, however, was what transformed suspicion into horror. Wrapped tightly in the tarp was Serenya's body, mutilated beyond comprehension. The reality of what had occurred became undeniable and devastating. Dr. Keiran Holt, the forensic pathologist, arrived soon after to examine the scene. His expertise revealed details that painted a grim picture of the night before. The crime was not one of sudden impulse, it carried marks of deliberation and intent. The brutality inflicted upon Serenya went beyond the act of ending her life. It was an attempt to erase her identity entirely. The decapitation was not only gruesome, but symbolic, a sign of Alaric's deep desire to strip her of everything that made her admired and loved. For the officers and detectives present, the sight was overwhelming. Even seasoned professionals felt the chill of standing in the presence of such violence. The contrast was striking. This had been the home of a woman known for her kindness, now transformed into a scene of unimaginable cruelty. Detective Maevis Karr, hardened by years of experience, knew immediately this was more than just a domestic dispute that had escalated. It was the manifestation of something far darker, the culmination of obsession and control taken to its most extreme end. Word of the discovery spread through the town at a rapid pace. Neighbors who had once admired the Dorne couple stood in disbelief as rumors turned into confirmed horror. The same White House they had passed by countless times now carried the stigma of a crime that felt too savage to belong in their quiet community. Serenya's friends wept openly, struggling to reconcile the image of her warm smile with the brutality of her death. Meanwhile, Alaric was nowhere to be found. The man who had once walked silently by Serenya's side was now a fugitive of sorts, though he had not run far. Every trace left in the house pointed directly to him. There was no question of another suspect. All evidence led back to the quiet husband, who had hidden so much rage behind his reserved demeanor. As investigators gathered what they could, Detective Karr realized the story was only beginning. The discovery of Serenya's body was the first layer, but understanding Alaric's motives and state of mind would be the challenge ahead. What had happened in that house was not just an act of violence, it was a revelation of how deeply obsession could corrode a human soul, leaving behind only destruction. The evidence was overwhelming, but the question of why loomed larger with each passing hour, haunting everyone involved in the case. Alaric Dorne was brought into custody quietly, his capture almost anticlimactic compared to the brutality of the crime he had committed. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee across state lines or vanish into anonymity. He was found only a short distance from home, walking aimlessly as though the weight of what he had done had drained him of purpose. When officers approached, he did not resist. His face carried no expression, his eyes distant, his body calm in a way that unsettled everyone around him. It was as if the act itself had emptied him, leaving behind a shell that functioned without emotion. At the station, Alaric was placed in an interview room, a small space with white walls and the hum of a single fluorescent light above. Hours passed as detectives tried to read him, waiting for some flicker of humanity to surface. He sat with his hands folded, eyes downcast, showing no signs of fear or guilt. To the untrained eye, he might have looked like a man waiting for a routine appointment, not someone accused of a crime that had horrified an entire community. The stillness in his demeanor was, in its own way, more frightening than if he had raged or cried. Detective Maevis Karr entered the room knowing that this was not going to be a straightforward interview. She had encountered liars, manipulators, and those who broke under pressure, but Alaric was different. His silence was not resistance, it was indifference. Hours of questioning yielded nothing but short, clipped answers that revealed little about the man behind the crime. Yet there was something in his eyes, an absence of warmth, a void that suggested he had long since detached from the ordinary emotions of grief, remorse, or even anger. When the confession finally came, it arrived not with theatrics or sudden breakdowns, but with a chilling calm. Alaric admitted to killing Serenya in a voice so steady it made the words heavier. He described his thoughts leading up to the act, recounting how he believed Serenya's kindness to others was a deliberate betrayal, how her light was something that diminished him, rather than lifted him. To Alaric, she was not a partner or a person anymore. She had become a symbol of everything he feared: abandonment, loss of control, humiliation. He explained how he had convinced himself that ending her life was the only way to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. The decapitation, he admitted, was not born of impulse but of intention. It was an act meant to destroy not just her body, but the image of her that lived in the minds of others. He wanted her gone entirely, reduced to nothing, erased from the admiration she inspired. His words were methodical, almost detached, as if he were describing a task he had completed rather than confessing to an unspeakable crime. Detective Karr listened, her years of experience keeping her outward composure steady, but inside she felt the weight of his words pressing hard. In her career she had heard confessions filled with tears or anger, but rarely had she encountered someone who spoke with such precision, such lack of hesitation, about something so grotesque. The clarity with which Alaric admitted to the murder suggested that he had been rehearsing this moment in his mind long before it actually happened. The written statement he provided was equally unsettling. His handwriting was neat, his sentences structured with a calm logic that belied the horror of their content. It was not the scrawl of a frenzied mind, but the deliberate record of a man who believed he had justified his action. For the officers who later read it, the words were haunting, not only for what they described but for the composure behind them. The news of the confession spread quickly, and the community struggled to reconcile the image of Alaric Dorne, the quiet man who lived among them, with the monster he had revealed himself to be. For many, the confession was worse than the discovery of Serenya's body. It was proof that the murder was not an accident, not a moment of rage that spiraled out of control, but a carefully considered decision carried out with chilling intent. In the eyes of the law, the confession sealed his fate. There was no room for doubt, no cracks in the evidence that could be exploited in a trial. But for those who heard his words firsthand, the confession did more than confirm his guilt. It exposed the terrifying reality of how far obsession and jealousy could drive a human being. It revealed a mind so warped by control and fear of loss that it could rationalize the unthinkable as necessary. As Alaric was led back to his holding cell, he remained as calm as when he was first taken into custody. No remorse, no tears, no sign of inner torment. To the detectives he seemed almost relieved, as though the burden of hiding his obsession had finally been lifted. The man who had once stood silently at his wife's side had now spoken, and what he revealed chilled everyone who listened. The aftermath of Serenya Dorne's murder rippled through the town like a wave of grief and disbelief, touching every corner of the community. What had once been a quiet suburban neighborhood filled with family routines and simple joys, was now marked by the shadow of horror. The white picket fences and tidy gardens looked the same, but for those who knew Serenya, nothing would ever feel normal again. The house where she once lived became an unapproachable landmark, a constant reminder of how fragile the illusion of safety could be. Her funeral drew crowds larger than the town had seen in years. People who had only known her in passing came to pay their respects, driven by shock as much as sorrow. They placed flowers at the church steps, spoke quietly about her kindness, and tried to understand how a life so bright could have been extinguished with such brutality. Friends wept openly, recounting the ways Serenya had touched their lives, from her small gestures of generosity to her tireless community efforts. Yet every memory was shadowed by the brutality of her death, a detail no one could shake no matter how hard they tried. Inside the courtroom, the trial was swift. Alaric Dorne's confession left little for the defense to argue. His words were unambiguous, his account unwavering, and the forensic evidence supported every disturbing detail. There were no long deliberations, no dramatic surprise. The jury listened, horrified but resolute, and delivered a guilty verdict without hesitation. The judge, reflecting on the severity of the crime, sentenced Alaric to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision was met with quiet relief in the courtroom, but the relief was tempered by the lingering question of how such darkness had remained hidden for so long. During the proceedings, Alaric's demeanor remained unchanged. He stood without emotion, his eyes steady, his posture calm, as though he was a man detached from his own fate. He showed no remorse, no grief, no flicker of regret for what he had done. It was this emptiness that unsettled the most. Witnesses described feeling as if they were in the presence of someone who had long since abandoned any sense of humanity. His silence was not that of a broken man, but of someone who no longer cared about how the world perceived him. Detective Maevis Karr, who had led the investigation, later reflected that it was one of the most haunting cases of her career, not because of the evidence, which was clear and decisive, but because of the profound absence of humanity in Alaric's actions and words. She described him as a man who had allowed obsession to rot him from the inside until nothing was left but a cold determination to destroy. To her, the case was a reminder that evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits quietly, hidden behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary home, until the moment it decides to reveal itself. The community struggled to heal. For months, people avoided walking past the Dorne residence, crossing the street rather than look at the house that had once symbolized suburban peace. Eventually the property was sold, but even new owners could not erase its history. To longtime residents, it remained tainted, a silent monument to the night when love turned into horror. Parents whispered warnings to their children about appearances being deceiving, and neighbors watched one another with a new sense of caution. The shock had left its mark, turning trust into suspicion. Serenya's legacy, however, lived on through the people she had touched. Friends created a small foundation in her name, dedicated to community outreach and support for women facing controlling or abusive partners. It was their way of turning tragedy into something meaningful, ensuring that her life would not be remembered solely for how it ended. Yet no matter how noble the efforts, the weight of what had happened lingered. Her name carried with it both love and loss, a bittersweet reminder of all that had been taken. Alaric Dorne remained in prison, where he quickly became infamous among other inmates and staff. His lack of remorse, his calm acceptance of a life behind bars, made him a figure of both fear and fascination. He never spoke of Serenya again, never sought forgiveness, never hinted at regret. It was as if he had severed himself from the world the moment he severed her life, existing now only as a hollow reminder of what unchecked obsession can become. The story of the Dornes was retold many times over the years, in news reports, in hushed conversations, and in the minds of those who had known them. What lingered was not only the horror of the crime, but the unsettling truth that it had all happened in plain sight, hidden beneath the mask of a quiet marriage. For the town, the tragedy became a permanent scar, and for those who remembered Serenya, it was a painful lesson. Even the calmest surface can conceal the darkest depths.